What's going on, everybody? Today on my C5 Corvette, I'm going to be installing a Summit Racing Harmonic balancer or dampener and ARP Crank Bolt. First thing I did was took off the battery cables. It's supposed to do negative first. I always mess up on that, but I'm doing that because I'm going to be taking off the alternator. Took off the plug first and then used the 13mm ratchet to take off the battery cable from the back. I usually put the bolt right back on after I got the cable off, and that's so I don't forget where it's at. And then next step was to get the alternator mounting bolts off. Those are both 15mm on the front. I couldn't get to the bottom bolt, so I had to go around and use the 15 to untension the belt and remove that, so I can get to that bottom bolt. And then once I got that off, I went ahead and removed the alternator. I used a crowbar, but that's kind of risky because you can damage the alternator. So on the bottom side, in order to get the cradle loose, I'm gonna have to remove the sway bar. So there's two 13mm right here, and then there's a 18mm right there for the end link. Gonna bust that loose with a ratchet and then use a open end and a Allen wrench to put in there to keep that from spinning. Once I got the mounting brackets for the bushings loose, the sway bar dropped just a little bit. Had to take out the end links from the control arm. Then I was able to get it out the way. Now would be a good time to change the end links, but they look good to me, so I'm not going to change them. Just going to leave it. Next up, I removed the steering rod or link from the rack. It's a 13mm bolt down in here. Once you get it off, don't turn your steering wheel. You can mess up your clock spring and your airbag. Do not move it. Just remember where it is. Remember how your rack and pinion was taken out. Then I got to remove these two 18mm lines right here to the rack, as well as these 13mm on the ABS unit for the brakes. Then on the bottom side for this bracket, there's two more 13mm bolts, and then for the rack and pinion, there's two 18mm bolts on the back and front. So before I removed the rack and pinion mounting bolts, I went ahead and removed the tie rods, since I'm going to have to hammer the separation fork in there. So that's an 18mm socket. Went ahead and used the breaker bar. So it's time to loosen up the cradle on the driver's side in order to slide out the rack and pinion. I've seen people just move it over to the passenger side without fully taking it out, but I'm going to take it out. So I'm going to use a 13/16 socket and loosen these bolts up to where I can't see any threads at the tip anymore. Don't use an impact wrench on these. I've watched so many videos and the guys just keep saying don't do it, so I guess it's the way the bolt is set inside of the chassis, it could end up ruining it. So at this point, I didn't really catch a lot on film when taking the rack out because the power steering lines kind of got annoying. I couldn't get my box wrench or my opening wrench in there to get them loose. I eventually did it. I had to take the fans off. Got to make sure you unplug the rack. There's a plug or a sensor or something going into that. But I got it off. Apparently it's leaking. It might be the power steering pump leaking down on that. Who knows? Also took the air bridge off for the intake. As you know, I got a Veram intake. It's ram air. So the stock crank bolt on a LS1 is a 24 millimeter socket. I tried with the extension on there, the jack handle. It didn't work. You gotta use a torch on that bolt unless you're just that strong. I used the torch for like 2 minutes the first time, didn't work. Came back, used it for about 5 minutes, and that worked. I had forgot that I torched the bolt, so it kind of got hot. Once I got the bolt out, I quickly realized I didn't have the right tool to get the pulley off, and had to buy one. The old 350, the claw style one, does not work. It's going to be a Chrysler pulley remover if you want to go and rent it from your local parts store. It looks like this. You stick the little rod inside the center and then put the claws in. It's really easy. And then as far as putting it on, you need a LS balancer install tool. I'll be sure to put a link in the description of the video. Here's the old balancer. I got it off. I guess they're not really designed too great because there's this rubber insulation in the center and it starts to separate with age, so you end up with a wobble. It either walks forward into the rack and pinion or walks back into the motor. With me, I got lucky, didn't walk back, so I just noticed the wobble. Then it was the belt was chirping really loud, and I thought it was one of the tensioners, but it wasn't. So we got the new Summit one. Only has a little bit of rubber, but this one does not separate like the old one, and it was only $200. Yes, it's bigger than the other one. It does have 8 ribs on the front. You can use this with a 8-rib supercharger belt if you're gonna supercharge your car, but if not, you just put it all the way to the front on the front 6 ribs, and it works perfect. So clean the front of my motor off. I used a razor. I couldn't find like a putty knife or anything, and yeah, I'm gonna end up installing the front crank seal. They recommend doing this anytime you take that pulley off. After cleaning the motor, went ahead and removed the old crank seal. Got a crank seal removal tool, or just the seal removal tool, off of Amazon. I'll post a link for that. It's fairly easy to use. You just gotta use some force though. I cleaned out the surface so that I could put the new one in. I had put it in the freezer like somebody else did, and in hopes it would shrink up and get in there. It went in there a little bit, and then I used a wooden block and a hammer to just make sure it fit in all the way. Didn't damage it. Here's how far it goes on without using the oven or an install tool. It's not going very far. Highly recommend not using the torch on the center because you can burn the seal and end up destroying that. This is the installer I tried to use. Didn't work. Get the LS one. Make your life easy. The instructions call for preheating your oven to 250 and leaving the balancer in there for 15 minutes, and then that should assist it with sliding on. You can also put oil in the middle and on the crank snout. I did it. It didn't fully go on, but it went on enough for me to thread the bolt in enough to tighten it. I knew I had it on when I put on the AC belt and it lined up correctly. It'll stop going back after a while too. I do have a 6-speed car, so I did put it in 6th gear in order to tighten the old bolt on the crank. And then after I was done with that, removed it and got the new bolt. The new bolt calls for 235 foot-pounds of torque, which is a lot. Even though the stock one calls for 250, I could barely even get to 235. The ARP bolt comes with lubricant that I had to put on the bottom of the head as well as the threads, and then slide the washer on and put some more on the other side of the washer as well. The bolt head size on the ARP bolt is 1 1/16. That's it. Now it's time for me to bolt everything back up. Got to get the rack back in. You got to use like a fork or a crowbar in between the frame and the cradle. Slide that back in all the way over to the passenger side. The hose coming from the bottom of the pump to the top hole is the hardest one. Once again, it's just an 18 millimeter. I suggest using a box wrench, but you're probably gonna have to use the open end too. Got to tighten back up the bracket for the ABS unit. Make sure you put back on the top 13 millimeter bolts on both sides. Connect the steering linkage back to the rack and pinion, 13 millimeter bolt. Tighten the cradle nuts back up to 81 foot-pounds of torque. Tighten the ABS bracket back up. Tighten the rack and pinion back up. Put the alternator back on. Put the belt back on. Make sure it lines up nicely. Gonna go to the passenger side. Take a look. Looks good to me. Put the cooling fans back in. Plug both fans in to their wire harness. Make sure that the wiring's back on, especially the rack and pinion wire or a little plug and sensor. That snaps right back on those power steering lines. Gonna use my torque wrench to tighten these back up, but I put on the stabilizer bar. You want to make sure you don't put that on first so you can torque that up. Want to tighten up the tie rod ends. Supposed to be 15 foot-pounds on the first pass, 33 on the second pass. That's the final pass. Put the air bridge back on. Don't forget to fill up with power steering fluid. Bleed that system out by turning it back and forth. And then it's the moment of truth after everything's plugged back in, including the battery. Just go ahead and start it up. And it looks good, running straight, no squilling. Just to show you what it sounded like before, I got some clips. I'm sorry these aren't horizontal, they were vertical. It's running good, driving good, everything's smooth. And that's it. Took it for a cruise. Got the Super Bowl. It's gonna be at SoFi. Got a rep for LA, even though I'm a Raiders fan. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.